Introduction. Some people have a tough time understanding what a concept is and what constitutes its underlying ontology. Atheists and mathematicians are particularly known to attribute mysticism, magic, and supernatural powers to concepts. They believe that concepts such as energy, mass, time, field, and force are some type of mystical incorporeal entities in the universe, akin to invisible souls or spirits. They specifically ascribe motion to concepts and have them perform phenomena in the universe, like coming in contact with stars, planets, and people, or even swallowing astronauts and clocks. These folks cannot tell you what these alleged entities are, they can't visualize them or even describe them for you. But they will fight tooth and nail to get you to believe that their alleged conceptual entities are real, exist out there in the universe, and they directly affect our daily lives. Fortunately, most people do understand that concepts are nothing but thought processes, which are mediated by the atoms of our brain. Concepts are the fundamental building blocks of not just words, but of our intelligence. Concepts necessarily imply meaning. You cannot refer to or even use a concept in its proper context without an explicit understanding of what it associates. Without concepts, it becomes impossible to invent words and tautological systems, to imagine and visualize objects, or to understand anything at all. Everything we understand comes from concepts, and concepts only. This article will explain in detail what a concept is, why concepts don't exist, how concepts define words, build languages, facilitate understanding, and why they are the basis of our intelligence and a measure of our IQ. What is thought? Thought is ultimately rooted in the atomic activity of our brain. Atoms interact with each other via surface-to-surface contact and signal transmission. But from a higher level of abstraction that we can directly relate to our experience, thought results from a process of mental identification and association. This is exactly what we do even for the most basic of thoughts. Just try to think of anything and attempt to mentally account for the source of that thought. You will realize that you are inevitably identifying entities and associating them. This whole process you've just performed is what we call conceptualization. The resulting mental construct or association from this process is what we call thought, idea, or concept. The primary purpose of concepts is for cognition, not for communication, as is usually assumed. Communication is merely the application of utility, not the primary purpose of conception. Cognition precedes communication, obviously, because the necessary precondition of communication is that we understand something before we communicate it, not only with words but with other methods. By associating entities into concepts, we are able to organize, classify, and generalize complex thoughts into simpler and therefore more easily usable cognitive units that take less brain activity to process. The primary utility of concepts is to allow intelligent beings to understand and communicate their cognitive units to each other. Concepts are therefore used to build languages and to provide beings with a system of cognitive classification and organization which enables them to acquire intelligence on an unlimited scale. What is the underlying foundation of a concept? Unlike images that we can visualize of real standalone entities, concepts cannot be visualized as discrete entities. Why? Because they are the result of atomic activity in the brain, not of standalone entities in our environment. Concepts are associative, they relate objects, and only result from thought. They can only be thought about or referenced by means of the name we assign them. The name is what we call a word. Words are labels for concepts, they label the explicit association between objects so the specific association can be referenced as a whole during communication. Concepts lighten the load on memory and enhance our ability to communicate. For example, at the airport, when asked what you have in your suitcase, you never answer with a detailed list of items: 2 jackets, 3 pairs of shoes, 4 t-shirts, pants, the Bible, the God Delusion, magazines, documents, and so forth. More likely your answer will be clothes and reading material. This is an example of how we can use concepts to abstract individual related entities into categories. Without a doubt, concepts are the underlying basis of all our thought processes. They are rooted in our ability to form languages, communicate and comprehend not just words, but complex abstractions, which are invented on a daily basis. All words are first and foremost concepts of language, known as lexical concepts. Furthermore, all words have an intrinsic ontological basis that can be resolved and grouped into 2 distinct categories: objects or concepts. We rationally justify this ontological basis in detail later, but first, we must understand the foundation of the word concept. And to do so, we need to define for our reader some key terms, specifically, object and concept. Since we are using the word object as a key term which underlies the basis of our whole discussion, we had better be able to unambiguously define this term which makes or breaks our argument, right? Otherwise, how will the reader understand in no uncertain terms what we mean by object? Intelligent beings are a direct product of their environment. Even their thoughts are a direct product of their environment because anything they think about has a relative reference to something else in their environment. There is no thought that can be conceived by any being, human, alien, or even God, that can be declared as absolute, i.e. not in relation to something within the context of their environment. Consider, for example, the concept up. The instant you think of it, you automatically associate it with the concept down in reference to a surface and an observer. Thinking of the concept running automatically associates a being that performs this action on a surface. The point of this is to understand that we can't even conceive of any concept or imagine anything without referencing associations between objects. Those who disagree or those who believe in absolutes are welcome to post their reasoned argument in the comments section. The instant you conceive of any thought/idea, you have automatically invoked a minimum of two objects with some type of association between them, whether you realized it or not. Absolutes are impossible to conceive, and that's why there is no absolute truth. How do we define concept? Concepts are the thought associations we establish with entities in our environment for the purposes of a. Ascribing meaning to these associations, b. Facilitating understanding, c. Applying utility to these associations, i.e. language, math, logic, technology, business, etc. Before we formulate a rational and unambiguous definition for concept that can be used consistently, let's get a basic impression of what some popular dictionaries have to say. Note that we will not use a dictionary or reference for the purposes of forcing it down people's throats as an argument from authority. Only those who can't understand and justify their definitions and arguments commit such fallacies, right? Oxford Dictionary, an idea or mental image, which corresponds to some distinct entity or class of entities. Webster Dictionary, an abstract or generic idea generalized from particular instances. The Free Dictionary, a general idea derived or inferred from specific instances or occurrences. Are pretty much on the right track, but they need to clean up their painful ambiguities, i.e. fallacy of equivocation, and eliminate synonyms, i.e. rhetoric, to make their definitions crisp, clear, and to the point. Like Einstein said, even a barmaid should be able to understand our definitions. Dictionaries are written by English graduate students and usually list definitions in quick and loose ordinary speech with ambiguity, rhetoric, and inconsistency. Obviously, we need to come up with a rational definition which can be understood by anyone, even a shoeshine boy. Looking at the key terms in the definitions above, we can understand that a concept is a thought process, i.e. idea, that is dependent upon establishing an association between objects, i.e. entities, instances, occurrences. This is unavoidable. In fact, it is impossible to conceive of an idea which does not have any associations, i.e. corresponds, generalizes, infers, with some objects. And of course, this makes sense because as humans, our thoughts and our words are a direct product of our natural environment, i.e. reality/existence, which only consists of objects. As an example, when we invented the concept surfing, this notion tacitly associated the objects water, surfboard, and human in a dynamic relation. These three objects are directly interrelated because each performs its own specific activity to collectively mediate this phenomenon we call surfing. Even though it may not be readily apparent to us, this is how people invent words in all languages. As concepts, words are nothing more than relations between specific objects which will convey our intended meaning. Now that we have a clear understanding of what a concept is, we have all the ammunition required to rationally define concept in no ambiguous terms. Concept, a relation between two or more objects. Synonym, idea, thought, notion, cogitation, conception, conceit. Remember, all words are lexical concepts. What they reference may either be an object or a concept. The concept is our fundamental unit of understanding, as this is the only way we can give meaning to the syntactic labels of language we call words. Furthermore, the concept is the fundamental unit of intelligence, as discussed later. All concepts are defined. Without concepts, there are no thoughts or words, much less language. Any form of cognition or communication becomes impossible. Even sign language, arm/hand movements, smoke signals, smoke patterns, Morse code, audible sequences, caveman grunts, audible sequences, etc. are all based on concepts, i.e. relations between objects. Question: other than concepts, what do all the various modes of communication have in common? Answer: meaning. All concepts necessarily have meaning that is derived from the explicit relationship between the invoked objects. Without the conveyance of meaning, what would be the purpose of words, sign language, smoke signals, Morse code, caveman grunts, etc.? Would we do this stuff to please the gods? If so, they must have meaning then, it is inescapable. Even the word concept has a meaning. Believe it or not, there are proponents of the claim that words don't have and should not have any meaning whatsoever. No, it's not just the patients in the asylum, I am talking about actual folks who are out there advertising their ignorance in society and on the internet. They don't realize it, but their position is self-refuting because they used words to convey their expressive desired meaning to us. They can't have it both ways. Regardless, a concept without meaning is an oxymoron, and those who perpetuate such nonsense are obviously morons. I see some people laughing, but please. Have some respect and political correctness for these simple-minded ignoramuses. Nobody deserves to be ridiculed for no legitimate reason. Since all concepts convey meaning, it goes without saying that concepts must be defined in no ambiguous terms. Words with multiple meanings are committing one of the fallacies of ambiguity, specifically, the fallacy of equivocation. Sure, there are words which have acquired various meanings in ordinary speech, like the word band, for example. This is fine for ordinary speech and colloquialisms. But the proponent of a critically reasoned argument is responsible for defining his key terms, which underlie his argument. In no ambiguous terms, equivocation is not allowed. This means that his key terms must only have one defined meaning that is used consistently in the context of his own argument. Otherwise, not even the author will understand what he is talking about if his terms have various irreconcilable meanings. Eliminating ambiguity is a very simple task. Laziness is no excuse in what they represent. They must capture, either explicitly or implicitly, all the relations between the objects associated with the concept in question. Only then will the definition be rational and unambiguous. Only then can one use it consistently in their critically reasoned argument. As an example, look at the definition of the word concept above and compare it to the sloppy ambiguous definitions provided by most dictionaries. No wonder there has been a lot of confusion over what constitutes an object and a concept. No wonder atheists and mathematicians don't understand what a concept is or whether concepts exist as standalone entities in reality. When we don't define words unambiguously, we inject much confusion, if not mysticism, into our imprecise meanings. This allows the proponent of an argument to play double dutch with his intentionally loose key terms. His intentions are disingenuous. He aims to deceive, not to elucidate. He builds his argument with handy dualities used as sleights of hand to confuse you by pushing forward various irreconcilable positions in his argument. His goal is to persuade you to accept his argument from various points of entry. This is no different than what the sophists did in ancient Greece with their tricks of circular logic, dualities, contradictions, rhetoric, ambiguity/equivocation, reification, etc. Their aim was to confuse, deceive, and persuade. Those who don't define their key terms are using the same linguistic tricks, mental gymnastics, and obfuscations to deceive you. Obviously, intellectual discussions will not be influenced by such circus shows. Regardless of whether one's usage of concepts is knowingly or inadvertently dishonest, they are forewarned that it will be extremely easy to expose all their sophistry in detail. These tricks are old news, over 2,500 years old. What is the underlying ontology of a concept? Naturally, the critical reader will ask, what objects are responsible for mediating the relation of the lexical concept or of any other lexical concept in and of itself? Since any lexical concept, like concept, is indeed a concept in and of itself, then it is a relation between objects. This whole abstraction of the underlying interrelated objects is what we collectively refer to as a concept. The concept is the referent, i.e., that which a word refers to, of the word unto itself. We say that such words fall into the category of concepts as opposed to objects. The objects that a lexical concept relates are what mediates the brain activity, which we usually call thought. Specifically, the concept, i.e. mental thought, of any word ontologically relates to the neurons in our brains and the mediation of signals between them. It is the synchronous motion of neurons, and ultimately atoms, which mediate this phenomenon or state in our brain that we call concept, idea, thought, etc. Since our definition of concept was rational and unambiguous, we were able to use it consistently onto itself without ambiguities or contradictions. Is it possible for concepts to exist? Our environment is the universe, which is only comprised of objects that have a standalone physical presence and are said to exist. Since a concept is an association between objects, it is crystal clear that it is impossible for associations or relations to be standalone entities. Hence, it is impossible for concepts to exist. The individual objects that are being related can be said to exist as long as they are not abstract, i.e. concepts. But it is impossible for a concept to exist because its ontological primacy is not that of discreteness, i.e. that of a standalone entity. Its ontological primacy is that of an action, verb, i.e. that of a process of interatomic signal transmission. Verbs don't exist. Only objects exist, and it is objects that mediate verbs, right? I mean, there are no concepts running around wreaking havoc or getting chased by dogs, right? And there are no concepts in the universe grabbing the earth and moving it around the sun like a carousel, right? And there are no concepts acting like vacuum cleaners swallowing light, planets, astronauts, and clocks, despite what some with a wild imagination will have you believe, right? You see, neither God nor alien nor man can manufacture concepts. And they certainly don't acquire length, width, and height in zero time and pop out of the void and into reality, right? Intelligent beings can only think of concepts, assign words to them, define them, understand and apply them. Syntactical grammar versus contextual grammar. Some folks may have forgotten the syntactical and contextual grammar constructs of the language they were taught in grammar school. Sentences in linguistic grammars are context-sensitive and thus have two stages of grammatical verification, syntax and context. Once we verify that the syntax conforms to the syntactical rules of grammar, we ascribe meaning to the sentence using the analytical phase of contextual grammar. Syntactical grammar, the initial parsing phase of the sentential syntax that ensures sentences comply with the syntax rules of grammar, i.e. qualifying nouns with adjectives, verbs with adverbs, etc., etc. Contextual grammar, this final parsing phase of sentences renders comprehension by ascribing meaning to words and clauses while maintaining the contextual domain of their reference. Despite these and other linguistic issues, which underlie the primacy of our understanding of words and sentences, there are some out there who will vehemently oppose them. Dude, you sound just like my teacher. This semantic stuff is for educational purposes only. This is all unnecessary and pedantic grammatical problematizing. I am experienced enough to guarantee you that I know how to interpret and understand anything. LOL, you're such a tool. Unnecessary and pedantic grammatical problematizing, huh? Do you know how to interpret the Bible? If so, why haven't you enlightened the 30,000 plus sects of Christian denominations out there who still haven't resolved the issue? B. Do you know how to interpret the many theories of truth? After 3,000 years, philosophers are still arguing on what truth is. Can you enlighten them on the correct theory? C. Do you know how to interpret the 6 irreconcilable hypotheses of gravity, i.e. 0D gravitons, waves, warp space, force, field, energy? Which is the correct one in reality? D. Do you know how to interpret the proceedings of a murder trial and guarantee that sophistry or abuses in language will not persuade you as a member of the jury to put an innocent person behind bars? After all, don't the members of the jury draw conclusions from their own personal interpretation of the statements presented? E. Can you guarantee that every person out there will interpret statements in the exact same way as you? Clearly, some people lack the ability to think and reason the ultra basics. I didn't know this opposition to reason was out there until I ran into these folks online. If they can't even identify the self-refuting remarks in their own statements, would you trust these clowns to be the jury in your murder trial if you ever get wrongfully accused? It really doesn't take many of these clowns to lock you up forever, only one will do. But these lost souls underscore all the points in this article. I welcome such statements from clowns because they die at their point of conception. Their bellyaching is not an argument. The critical issue with grammar and language is that of comprehension. Some will make wild claims that they don't need to understand words, definitions, and grammar in order to understand a sentence or to even write a physics article. Isn't that a self-refuting statement? Without clear and precise language, there is no understanding to be had, even for the author of the argument. It is the proper use of concepts in grammar which allows us to present the proper context of our argument before the audience. Purposeful abuses in language have only one purpose: to deceive. Don't whine and complain that you don't understand your own argument when cornered. Clean up your linguistic failures, and it will be crystal clear to you. In the sections that follow, we explore how to evaluate the referent of a concept for the purposes of determining its ontological usage in a sentence. End of Part 1.